Okay, let's kick this off. Picture this. Howard Schultz, the Starbucks guy, he has this kind of stark wake-up call moment.
Uh-huh.
He's actually in a coffee shop that's serving his own coffee brand, but the whole experience, it's just underwhelming. It's slow, kind of messy. The coffee's not quite right.
Not what he envisioned, I imagine.
Exactly. And then almost at the same time, he gets this call from McDonald's. They want to jump into the specialty coffee market, maybe even using Starbucks beans.
Wow, okay, that's significant.
Right. So Schultz flies back to Seattle, and he's got these two, really fundamental questions just buzzing in his head. One, were they actually growing the best way possible? And two, were they maybe stretching themselves too thin, overextending in this big push for growth?
Yeah, that experience, I think it was called the brewery, that plus the McDonald's interest, it really throws a spotlight on this critical moment for Starbucks right there in the mid-90s. You've got this company, it's got incredible momentum, obviously, but that super fast growth, that desire to be everywhere, it brings up huge challenges for keeping the quality, the focus that made them successful in the first place. It's a classic growth problem.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we're really focusing on Starbucks right then, mid-90s. We're going to unpack this period of just explosive growth, the strategies they were using, and, the whole specialty coffee scene that was setting the stage. Our main source here is a business case study, so we're getting some real detail. And the mission really is to get our heads around those questions Schultz had. Was Starbucks really on the right track for growth, or were they maybe spreading themselves too thin, trying to do too much too fast?
And to really get that context,
Yeah.
you have to remember the bigger picture. Coffee, globally, it was huge. The second biggest traded commodity after oil.
Right, after oil. Amazing.
But within that, this really important difference was starting to emerge. You had your sort of basic coffee, the stuff you grab at the supermarket, and then this specialty coffee market that was just starting to boom. People saw it as, gourmet.
Gourmet, yeah. A step up.
And it wasn't just marketing talk. It really started with the actual quality of the coffee beans themselves.
And the numbers really tell that story, don't they, between those two types?
Oh, absolutely. Back in '94, the specialty coffee industry was it was exploding, growing at something like 15% a year, the estimate said.
15%.
Yeah, huge. Meanwhile, the regular basic coffee industry, kind of struggling to find any real growth.
And you can see why when you look at how those specialty beans actually got to the cup. It's not exactly a simple journey.
No, not at all. You're often talking about beans coming from really small farms, maybe less than 3 acres sometimes.
Tiny operations.
Exactly. And these farmers, they usually don't have the means or, the know-how to export directly. So the beans go through this whole chain of people, collectors gathering the crops, millers processing them, exporters, importers.
Wow.
Sometimes they change hands, like 5 times, before they even reach a specialty coffee company like Starbucks.
5 intermediaries, potentially.
Yeah, and all these people, they're focused specifically on getting those high-quality Arabica beans. That's what gets the premium price. It's a totally different world from the lower-grade Robusta beans used in most commercial coffee.
It's like this whole hidden, complex network just to get that morning latte made.
Pretty much. And the supply chain, it's so complex. It's also really vulnerable, right, to weather, diseases affecting the coffee plants, even politics and economics in the producing countries.
You mentioned that Brazilian frost back in '75. That had a massive impact, didn't it?
Huge. Sent prices through the roof.
Yeah.
And actually led to this long-term drop in coffee drinking in the U.S. for a while.
Right. And even back then, in the mid-90s, specialty coffee wasn't tiny. The source says it was already around, 31% of all coffee consumption?
Yeah, about a third. So that 15% growth wasn't just some small niche thing. It was a real shift.
Consumers were actively looking for better quality, willing to pay more.
Exactly. It forced the whole industry to kind of rethink things. And for Starbucks, well, that was the huge tailwind pushing them forward. But it also meant the pressure was really on to keep delivering on that quality and that brand promise.
Which, brings us nicely to the consumer side of things. What was happening with coffee drinking habits here in the U.S.?
Well, it's interesting. Per capita consumption had actually been going down since the peak in the 60s and 70s. By 1996, it was down to about 1.7 cups a day per person.
Huh. Less than 2 cups.
Yeah. And the National Coffee Association, they kind of blamed the big coffee companies, saying they hadn't really innovated, just focused on price wars. Poor product development, basically.
But then things started to turn around, with specialty coffee picking up steam.
Exactly. The trend started to reverse. And it's funny, if you looked back to, say, 1985 and compared the U.S. to places like Sweden or Denmark, or even coffee-producing countries like Costa Rica or Brazil,
Hmm.
the U.S. was actually drinking less coffee per person. But that was definitely changing in the 90s, and there were some clear reasons why, some real consumer trends driving it.
Okay, what were those key trends?
Well, there were about four big ones. First, people were becoming more health conscious, maybe choosing coffee over alcohol in social settings sometimes.
Right.
Second, coffee bars were turning into these important social spots, those third places we can talk more about.
Yeah, the community hub idea.
Third, specialty coffee felt like an affordable luxury, a little treat people could give themselves without breaking the bank.
Makes sense.
And fourth, and this is crucial, consumers were just getting smarter about coffee, more knowledgeable, more curious about where it came from, what made it good.
So who exactly was this specialty coffee drinker back then? Did the source give a profile?
It did paint a pretty specific picture, yeah. Mostly city dwellers, household income, usually over $35,000 a year, which was decent money then.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, it mentioned two-parent families with a stay-at-home mom were a key group. Also single people, college graduates.
And demographics, age, gender.
Yeah, women tended to drink more specialty coffee, and the 30 to 59 age bracket was the sweet spot. But the really big takeaway for companies like Starbucks, loyalty.
Ah, the loyalty factor.
Huge. Once people got a taste for that really good, high-quality specialty coffee, they generally didn't want to go back to the cheap stuff. They stuck with it.
That makes sense. You get used to the good stuff.
Exactly. And that ties into the whole community gathering place idea, too.
Mm-hmm.
Coffee houses weren't just for a quick morning caffeine hit anymore.
Right.
They were filling this real social need, a comfortable, accessible place to hang out, meet people, work, outside of home and the office. That modern living room idea.
So, okay, the market's booming. Consumers are changing habits. Who else was playing in this space? Starbucks wasn't alone, right?
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
Competition was coming from a few different angles. On the product level, you had specialty coffee competing against basic coffee, obviously.
Sure.
But also against tea, juice, soda, even alcohol. And it looked like specialty coffee's growth was partly taking share from those other drinks.
And even within the specialty coffee world, there was a split.
Yeah, pretty significant one. You had flavored coffee, which was actually a big chunk of sales, maybe 25%.
Mm-hmm.
Really popular with people maybe newer to coffee, younger crowds.
Okay.
But then you had the purists, companies like Starbucks, Peet's, Caribou. They notably didn't do flavored coffee back then. Unlike others, say Timothy's or Second Cup, who embraced the flavors.
Interesting strategic choice. Stick to the core or broaden the appeal.
Exactly that question. And you also had the big traditional coffee companies trying to get in on the action, launching their own sort of upscale supermarket brands. Competition was definitely heating up.
And where people were buying the specialty coffee was changing too, right? There was a forecast about that.
Yeah, a really big shift predicted. The expectation was that grocery stores, which sold most specialty coffee in the mid-90s, would drop significantly.
And specialty stores would take over.
With a projection. By 1999, specialty coffee shops were expected to be the main place people bought it. Complete reversal.
Wow. And the number of potential coffee shops was huge.
The SCAA Specialty Coffee Association estimated something like 10,000 potential coffee retail spots in the U.S. and Canada by '99. But only about half were expected to be full coffee bars or cafes. The rest would be smaller carts, kiosks, that kind of thing.
So easier for smaller players to get in with a cart, maybe?
Yeah, lower barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And the numbers showed that. Over 3,400 competitors out there, but most were just single-store operations, not looking for massive expansion.
But there were some bigger players making moves, besides Starbucks.
Oh, yeah, definitely some with regional or even national ambitions. You had Diedrich's Coffee, focusing on fresh roasted beans, light food, mostly in Texas, Colorado, California then.
Okay.
Green Mountain Coffee, mostly a wholesaler, actually, supplying lots of places. But they had some retail, too, often roasting right in the store.
Right.
Coffee people aimed for suburbs, business districts, smaller stores, but also pushing kiosks into busy spots. A.L. Van Hout, big, especially in Canada, supplied lots of restaurants and offices, plus had their own cafe bistros.
A lot going on.
And then Barney's Coffee and Tea, they were big on selling their own branded stuff, mugs and things, often in malls. They also had this larger restaurant concept, La Venezia Cafe, explicitly aiming for that third-place feel.
Trying to compete on atmosphere, too.
Yeah. Coffee Beanery was mostly a franchisor, lots of units, moving towards more standalone spots and franchising carts. chock full of nuts. Traditionally, a supplier was branching out into drive-thrus and sit-down cafes.
Diversifying.
And Appassionata was interesting, smaller, but aggressive, selling everywhere. Their own stores, franchises, wholesale, grocery, mail order, even co-branding with Taco Bell.
Taco Bell. Wow. Okay. Very scrappy.
Definitely a dynamic market. And then Second Cup, mostly franchising out of Canada. They grew through buying other companies, like Gloria Jeans.
Right. I remember Gloria Jeans.
Yeah, and they had different focuses. Second Cup, more on drinks and snacks. Gloria Jeans also big on selling mugs and beans. Plus, Second Cup made deals like getting their coffee onto Air Canada flights.
So many different strategies playing out.
Exactly. And the source material actually lays out some financial comparisons for these chains, which helps see how Starbucks stacked up.
Which leads us right into Starbucks' own strategy. What were their key pillars back then, that 96th annual report letter you mentioned?
Yeah, from Schultz and Orrin Smith. It really lays it out. They were proud of being the leader, over 1,000 stores by then. And they hammered home quality, finest Arabica beans, hiring the most talented people.
And that Starbucks experience? That was huge for them.
Absolutely central. It wasn't just selling coffee. It was creating this whole thing around it. And they were looking globally, plus starting those partnerships, like with Pepsi for Frappuccino, investing in roasting, manufacturing, exploring new channels like AOL Cafe. Their big goal was clear: be the world's most recognized and respected coffee brand. Coffee and people. Those were the cornerstones.
And how did they ensure that quality, starting with the beans?
Well, their sourcing was pretty smart. They bought from different regions, Latin America, Pacific Rim, East Africa, partly for variety, partly to hedge their bets against problems in one area.
Diversification.
Exactly. And they didn't just buy beans. They built relationships with the exporters. They worked directly with them, offered training, made their quality standards really clear.
And because they bought so much.
They became a preferred customer. Mary Williams, who was their SVP of coffee, said basically, if a supplier had amazing beans, Starbucks got the first call.
Nice position to be in.
Definitely. And their quality control was intense. A 3-sample process.
3 samples?
Yeah, an initial offer sample, one before shipping, and one when the beans arrived. And they could reject the batch at any stage if it wasn't up to snuff.
Wow. But as they grew so fast, doubling volume must have been a challenge for sourcing.
Huge challenge. How do you get twice as much great coffee? That's where blending became key.
Blending different beans together.
Yeah. Mary Williams had this analogy like baking a cake. You adjust the ingredients, the different beans, to keep the final taste consistent. So offering blends and also rotating single origin coffees gave them flexibility.
And they made a conscious choice not to grow their own coffee.
Right. They consistently decided against it. Seems like they wanted to focus on sourcing, roasting, retail, not farming. Stick to their knitting, basically.
Okay, so they sourced these great beans. What about roasting? Was that special?
They definitely considered it a core competency, almost a technological art. It was a precise mix of time and temperature, even with computerized roasters. They'd invested a lot in R&D to develop their unique roasting curves, and they embedded that into proprietary software. Made it really hard for anyone else to copy their exact roast profile.
Protecting their secret sauce.
Pretty much. And packaging was key, too. Vacuum sealing the beans immediately in those special bags with one-way valves to keep them fresh. Gave them a long shelf life, though internally they had stricter rules for stores.
Right, freshness is everything.
And then there was their whole supply chain operation, SCO. They claimed they got great transportation rates, managed complex bakery distribution, got good at forecasting demand.
Keeping things efficient.
Yeah, strong inventory turns, this integrated closed-loop system to protect bean quality. They focused on benchmarking against the best, hiring logistics experts, really believing in controlling the whole supply chain.
But again, the rapid growth must have strained that system across all their different business lines.
Oh, for sure. Retail, specialty sales, mail order, grocery. Ted Garcia, one of their execs, talked about needing innovative solutions, working closely with partners like UPS to handle the sheer volume and complexity.
Okay, so that brings us to the retail experience itself. The core of it all, really. The third place.
Absolutely. The retail store was the engine of their growth, and it was always meant to be more than just a place to buy coffee. It was an experience, that theatrical vibe Schultz wanted around the espresso machine.
Yeah, he described it as that place between home and work, for escape, connection, just being.
Exactly. And the formula had several key parts. The coffee, obviously, the employees, the baristas, the merchandise they sold, their ownership approach, how they picked real estate, the overall image, and constantly trying new things.
And the baristas were so critical to that.
Absolutely critical, often college students back then.
Yeah.
But they got extensive training, not just on making drinks, but on talking about coffee. Mary Williams mentioned customers asking really specific things like what coffee goes best with certain foods.
Wow, sophisticated questions.
Yeah. But the challenge, as they grew, was finding and keeping people who could consistently deliver that specific Starbucks culture and service. That was tough.
I bet. And the merchandise, it wasn't just Starbucks mugs, was it?
No, they were quite deliberate. They sold high-quality coffee makers from brands like Krups and Bodum, alongside their own branded stuff. The tricky part was getting a consistent program nationally when dealing with different suppliers.
And real estate. You mentioned their approach was opportunistic. What did that mean?
It meant they were flexible, they could fit stores into different kinds of spaces,
Yeah.
and they did that store clustering thing, opening several stores close together.
Right, to dominate a market.
To maximize market share, build that regional brand buzz. They had dedicated real estate managers and these specialized brokers they called street sniffers who knew the best spots.
Street sniffers. Love that.
Yeah. Arthur Rubenfeld, who ran real estate, stressed they were disciplined. They wanted to be fast, but they'd wait for the right spot, those A sites, ideally with parking.
But the pressure must have been immense to find enough locations for that 2,000 store goal by 2000.
Huge pressure. They needed 20 to 40 solid new locations every month. And they started looking beyond just the prime downtown corners, moving into different parts of cities. The source even shows typical store profit projections, gives you an idea of the economics.
And they also launched smaller formats, carts and kiosks.
Yeah, they called them doppio. Basically, putting the Starbucks brand on those smaller, often generic coffee stands you see in train stations or malls. Another way to reach more people.
So the retail stores were really the foundation for the brand image, domestically and thinking internationally too.
Totally. That's where they showcased the quality, the lifestyle. It was the anchor. And they saw potential to be more than just a coffee shop, maybe something bigger.
And that international push was a big part of the strategy. Why go global then?
Couple of reasons. Get in before competitors locked up key markets. Tap into the desire for Western brands overseas. And in many places, people just drank more coffee than in the U.S. They focused initially on Asia-Pacific, seemed manageable resource-wise, good population density.
And they expected international to become a big contributor.
Yeah, definitely. Within 5 or 10 years, they saw international retail adding significantly to the bottom line. There are forecasts in the source showing that expected growth.
Okay, so beyond their own stores, they had these specialty sales too. What did that involve?
Basically deals with other businesses to sell Starbucks coffee. Retailers, restaurants, airlines, hotels. It was about generating revenue, sure, but also massive brand exposure.
Getting them out there.
Exactly. And they were picky about partners. Wanted leaders known for quality themselves.
And you mentioned some examples earlier. United, Nordstrom, Barnes & Noble.
Yeah, PepsiCo for Frappuccino, Price Costco with the Meridian brand, Red Hook Brewery for that coffee beer concentrate, Dryers for ice cream, Airmark serving it in universities and hospitals.
A really diverse set of partnerships.
And it seems like these deals were becoming increasingly important strategically, less about just retail anymore.
And those new ventures were key parts of that shift, right? The ice cream, the bottled Frappuccino, getting into grocery stores.
Absolutely central. The Dryers ice cream deal, they expected it to bring in decent sales and earnings, but also introduce Starbucks to new customers, reinforce that premium image, and build ties with supermarkets, even if the immediate profit wasn't huge.
And the bottled Frappuccino with Pepsi, that sounded like a potential game changer.
Huge potential. Pepsi thought it could be a billion-dollar product. Their testing showed amazing repeat purchase rates, better than other big hits like Lipton iced tea had shown initially.
Wow.
And they thought it could do even better in places where cold coffee was already popular, like Asia. Selling it in Starbucks stores and using Pepsi's massive distribution network was smart.
And the grocery store push, why was that so important if stores were growing so fast?
Because people still make coffee at home. Starbucks realized supermarkets had that huge convenience advantage. Warren Smith basically said, we either let other brands own the home market or we compete there.
Makes sense. You need to be where the customer is.
Right. And they argued it was good for supermarkets. Too higher margins on specialty coffee, pulling shoppers towards more expensive coffee options. They tested it successfully in Portland and Chicago, eyeing a national rollout.
So grocery was a big piece of the puzzle. Any other channels?
Yeah, they were looking at higher-end restaurants, maybe partnering with chains like bagel shops or juice bars,
Yeah.
exploring all the
And
angles.
don't forget mail order.
Right, the Encore program served people who didn't have a store nearby, plus those loyal home brewers.
Mm.
Often led to bigger orders, too, people buying more than just coffee.
You really can't talk about this era of Starbucks without focusing on Howard Schultz himself.
Mm.
His vision was everything.
Absolutely fundamental. Taking from a small bean retailer, that trip to Milan in '83, seeing the coffee bar culture there, that was the spark.
Even though Starbucks initially rejected his idea for cafes.
Yeah, he left, started Il Journal, his own coffeehouse chain, and then came back and bought Starbucks. Quite the story.
And his background really drove him, didn't it? That fear of mediocrity.
Yeah, came from humble beginnings. First in his family to go to college, always pushing. Even in his mid-40s then, still incredibly hands-on, creative, inspiring, but yet demanding too. High standards.
Mhm.
Warren Smith mentioned how much he genuinely cared about the company culture.
And Scott Bedbury called him the onboard computer and the fuel, like people would follow him anywhere.
Captures it perfectly. He had this incredible ability to inspire that level of dedication.
Which connects directly to the people side of things, HR, the culture. How did they build that?
Well, they had that flatter structure, calling everyone partners, not employees. That was key. They really tried to value input from the baristas, since they were face-to-face with customers.
Mm.
Lots of communication between HQ and the stores, execs being accessible, regular mission reviews, open forums for feedback, trying to make people feel heard.
And the training for baristas was pretty intensive.
Oh yeah, 24 hours before they even served a customer. Plus, everyone knew, even executives did a 2-week stint working in a store.
Wow, even the execs.
Yeah, full immersion. And they offered decent pay for the time, good benefits, health, vision, dental, insurance, that free pound of coffee weekly, and crucially, beanstalk.
The stock options. That must have been huge for morale and retention.
Absolutely. They were careful about hiring at all levels. Their barista turnover was way lower than the industry average. And they were bringing in experienced managers from other big growth companies like Taco Bell, Nike, McDonald's, signaling serious ambition.
And they had those guiding principles, right, from the 95 report.
Yeah, 6 of them. About the work environment, diversity, highest quality coffee, customer enthusiasm, community and environment, and profitability, kind of covering all the bases of what they stood for. Aileen Carell's quote about just loving talking about coffee really showed that passion.
And that story about the values exercise with Jim Collins.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The whole senior team, independently, came up with almost the exact same core values. Passion, integrity, winning fairly, respecting partners, entrepreneurial spirit. Shows how aligned they were, how deep that culture ran.
And financially, it was obviously working. Stock price, earnings per share, all climbing fast.
Yeah, big increases over the previous 5 years. And investment firms were loving them. Lots of BUI ratings.
That William Blair report summary sounds typical, praising execution, ambitious goals, but noting the risks.
Exactly. Acknowledged they'd built the leading brand almost perfectly so far. Like the global ambition, the brand extensions, the grocery push. But yeah, pointed out these new ventures added risk. Still, they saw Starbucks as a core long-term growth stock, despite that higher risk profile.
And it's worth noting their ownership model mostly owning stores, not franchising like many competitors.
Right. That meant they needed more cash internally to grow, which you can see reflected in their balance sheet and income statements and the source material. But it also gave them tight control over the brand and the experience. Trade-offs.
But even with all that success, there were challenges looming, especially around the brand itself, brand equity.
Yeah, that was a key concern. Historically, the brand was the store experience. The smell, the sounds, the barista interaction. But the vision was shifting. Scott Bedbury talked about moving beyond just being the best place to get coffee to being the preferred brand overall, providing those uplifting moments even outside the store, like ripples from a rock in a pond spreading outwards.
But the risk there is dilution, right? Spreading the brand too thin.
Exactly. If you try to be everything, you might lose what made you special. And Liz Sickler pointed out another challenge. They hadn't really defined that broader brand image concretely yet before starting big national ad campaigns. They needed to leverage their size better against local players, compete more on brand recognition itself. So national advertising was just starting to become part of the conversation.
So it all circles back to Schultz and his dilemma.
Yeah. The company's committed to its strategy, constantly looking at new opportunities, stores here, stores abroad, specialty deals, grocery, mail order. But the core question hangs there.
Mm.
How do you manage all of that? How do you react to all these growth options in the best way?
Without dropping the ball on quality or culture, or just losing your way.
Precisely. How do you avoid overextending? That was the central concern.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's been a look at Starbucks at this really fascinating, pivotal moment in the mid-90s. Incredible growth, this complex market, all these different strategic threads they were pulling on.
Yeah, sourcing, the whole retail experience, these new ventures, and underneath it all, those big questions about growth and focus that Schultz was asking.
Were they growing the right way? Were they doing too much? The information we've gone through really highlights why those were such critical questions back then.
Definitely. The answers weren't obvious at the time, and you can argue the choices they made then are still playing out today in the Starbucks we see all around us.
So maybe a final thought to leave folks with, thinking about everything we've discussed from 97, the market, the competition, Starbucks' strategies, their culture, what potential problems or pitfalls might have been lurking just around the corner as they chased that huge global vision?
Or maybe looking at it the other way. How did that intense focus they had on the customer experience, on the quality of the coffee itself, how did that maybe set them up to navigate the challenges and changes in the coffee world that were still to come? Something to chew on.